Some players win trophies. Some players become legends. But a very small group did something even bigger. They forced the NHL to admit that the game itself had a problem. Because hockey rules are not just written in an office. A lot of them are written after somebody finds a loophole, breaks a tradition, terrifies a goalie, embarrasses the league on national television, or becomes so dominant that the old version of the sport can no longer contain him. And that is what makes these stories so interesting. The NHL did not change because everything was calm. It changed because someone pushed the game to its limit. A goalie became too good at playing the puck. A superstar made open ice feel unfair. A pest found a loophole so ridiculous that the league had to shut it down almost immediately. A shooter made the puck move in ways goalies were not ready for. A player's hit helped force the league to rethink head contact. And one goalie refused to keep playing unless he was allowed to protect his own face. These are the players who did not just play inside the rules. They made the NHL rewrite them. If you wanted to explain Sean Avery's career in one sentence, you could say this. He was not always trying to beat you at hockey. Sometimes he was trying to beat the rulebook. And in the 2008 playoffs, he found one of the strangest loopholes the NHL had ever seen. The New York Rangers were playing the New Jersey Devils. On the other side was Martin Brodeur, one of the greatest goaltenders in hockey history. The Rangers had a power play. The puck was in the Devils' zone, and Avery positioned himself in front of the net. So far, nothing unusual. Screening the goalie is part of hockey. You stand in front, take punishment from defensemen, block the goalie's view, and hope the puck gets through. But Avery did something different. Instead of facing the play, he turned around and faced Brodeur. Then he started waving his stick and arms directly in front of Brodeur's face. He was not trying to play the puck. He was not trying to deflect a shot. He was not even pretending to be involved in the normal action. He was simply trying to distract the goalie as aggressively and absurdly as possible. And here's the crazy part. At that moment, it was not clearly illegal. It looked ridiculous. It looked unsportsmanlike. It looked like something that should not be allowed in an NHL playoff game. But the rulebook did not have a clean answer for it. Avery had found a gap between what hockey expected players to do and what the rules technically said they could not do. The league reacted almost immediately. The next day, the NHL issued an interpretation of the unsportsmanlike conduct rule. From that point forward, a player could not stand facing the goalie and wave his stick or body in a way designed purely to distract him. It became known as the Sean Avery rule. And what makes this moment so perfect is that Avery did not change the NHL by being the best player in the world. He changed it by being shameless enough to ask a question nobody else wanted to ask. What if I do something so stupid that the rules forgot to ban it? The answer was simple. The NHL banned it. Sean Avery changed a rule by making hockey look ridiculous. Martin Brodeur changed a rule by being too good. For most goalies, playing the puck is a useful skill. For Brodeur, it was a weapon. He was not just stopping shots, he was controlling the entire defensive zone. When teams dumped the puck into New Jersey's end, Brodeur would leave his crease, get behind the net, and handle it like a third defenseman. He could stop the puck, move it to the right teammate, reverse it under pressure, or completely kill the forecheck before it even started. That mattered because the New Jersey Devils were already one of the most structured defensive teams in the league. They were famous for making games miserable. They clogged the neutral zone, they protected the middle, they forced opponents to dump the puck in. And then, when the opponent finally did dump it in, Brodeur erased that option too. Think about how frustrating that is. You cannot carry the puck cleanly through the neutral zone. You cannot generate speed. You finally decide to chip it behind the defense and chase it. Then Brodeur skates out and calmly turns it into a clean breakout. It was not illegal. It was brilliant. But for the NHL, it was also a problem. The league wanted more offense, more speed, more forechecking, more chaos around the net. And Brodeur's puck handling, combined with New Jersey's defensive system, helped slow the game down. So after the 2004 Suave lockout, the NHL introduced one of its most recognizable modern rule changes, the trapezoid. Behind each net, the goalie could only play the puck freely inside a specific trapezoid-shaped area. If he played it in the restricted corners, he received a delay of game penalty. The rule was not officially called the Brodeur rule, but everybody knew the connection. It was designed to stop elite puck-handling goalies from neutralizing dump-ins too easily. And Brodeur hated it. which makes sense because the rule attacked one of the things that made him special. But that is what makes this rule so fascinating. Brodeur was not cheating. He was not exploiting something dirty. He was simply using a skill that most goalies did not have at his level. The NHL looked at that skill and basically said, "You are too good at this. We need to make the rink smaller for you." That is when you know you changed the game. Wayne Gretzky changed hockey in almost every way a player can change hockey. He changed the record book. He changed how people thought about passing. He changed what was possible for an offensive player. But he also became associated with one of the most controversial rule changes of the 1980s. To understand it, you have to understand how terrifying the Edmonton Oilers were. The Oilers did not just beat teams. They overwhelmed them. Gretzky, Mark Messier, Jari Kurri, Paul Coffey, Glenn Anderson. They had too much speed, too much skill, and too many ways to punish mistakes. And one situation was especially dangerous: 4-on-4 hockey. With fewer players on the ice, there was more space, and if you gave Wayne Gretzky more space, you were basically handing him the keys to the game. At the time, when both teams received minor penalties at the same stoppage, the teams often played 4-on-4. For most clubs, that was just a normal consequence of coincidental penalties. For the Oilers, it could become a weapon. More open ice meant more room for Gretzky to think, create, and destroy defensive structure. So in 1985, the NHL changed the coincidental minor penalty rule. When both teams received minor penalties at the same time, teams would often remain at 5-on-5 instead of going to 4-on-4. The change became widely known as the Gretzky rule. Officially, it was not just about Gretzky. It was about game management, fairness, and preventing teams from using coincidental penalties to create more open ice. But the nickname stuck because everyone understood the reality. When a player is so dangerous in open space that the league changes how penalties affect manpower, that player is not just dominating the game. He is bending the structure of the game around himself. The funny part is that the rule did not last forever. It was eventually reversed in the early 1990s, and 4-on-4 hockey came back. But the fact that it happened at all says everything. The NHL had the greatest offensive player in history, on one of the fastest teams ever assembled, and it looked at the rulebook and asked, are we accidentally giving these guys even more room? That is the kind of fear Gretzky created. Not fear of a hit, not fear of a fight, fear of space. Sometimes the NHL changes because of one moment. Sometimes it changes because a piece of equipment evolves faster than the rulebook. That is what happened with the curved stick. For a long time, hockey sticks were relatively straight. Players could still shoot hard, obviously. But the blade did not create the same kind of whip, lift, and deception that later generations would take for granted. Then, players started experimenting. Stan Mikita is often credited with discovering the advantage of a curved blade almost by accident. According to the famous story, a broken or bent stick changed the way the puck came off the blade, and Mikita realized there was something there. Bobby Hull, with his terrifying slap shot, helped turn that idea into a league-wide problem. Hull already had one of the hardest shots in hockey. Now give him a blade that could help launch the puck faster, higher, and with more unpredictable movement. For goalies in that era, this was not a small issue. Their masks and pads were nothing like modern equipment. Many goalies were still adjusting to the idea of face protection. The puck was already dangerous. A heavily curved stick made it even harder to read. Shots could rise suddenly. They could dip. They could come off the blade in ways that made reaction time even more brutal. And because hockey players are hockey players, the curves got more extreme. If a small curve helped, someone would try a bigger curve. If a bigger curve helped, someone would push it further. Eventually, the NHL had to step in. The league limited how much curve a stick blade could have. This was not just about competitive balance. It was about safety. It was about making sure the puck did not become too unpredictable for the people standing in front of it. And that is the pattern you see over and over again in NHL history. A player finds an edge. The edge spreads. Then the league has to decide whether that edge is innovation or danger. With curved sticks, the answer was both. The curve never disappeared. In fact, it became a normal part of hockey. Every modern player uses some kind of blade pattern. But the NHL made sure it had limits. Because Bobby Hull with a slap shot was already scary enough. Bobby Hull with an unlimited curve was something else entirely. Not every rule change begins with a clever loophole. Sometimes it begins with blood. On November 1st, 1959, Montreal Canadiens goalie Jacques Plante was hit in the face by a shot from Andy Bathgate. Plante was cut badly. He needed stitches. And in that era, this was almost treated as part of the job. Goalies played without masks. They stood in front of slap shots with their faces exposed. Broken noses, cuts, lost teeth, and facial injuries were considered the price of being brave. But Plante had already been practicing with a mask. He believed in it. He knew it could protect him. His coach, Toe Blake, did not like the idea. At the time, many people thought a mask was a sign of fear or weakness. After the injury, Plante made his stand. He refused to go back into the game unless he could wear the mask. That decision changed hockey culture forever. At first, people mocked it. Some questioned his toughness, some treated it like a strange experiment. Then Plante kept winning, and that is usually how hockey changes. Not when an idea is safe, not when everybody agrees, but when the person challenging tradition proves the new way works. The mask gave goalies something they had never truly had before: permission to protect themselves. Over time, goalie masks became standard. Then they became essential. Eventually, the idea of an NHL goalie playing without a mask became unthinkable. Plante did not simply introduce a piece of equipment. He changed what courage meant. Before Plante, courage meant standing in the net with your face exposed because that was how it had always been done. After Plante, courage could mean something smarter. It could mean protecting yourself so you could keep playing. And in a sport that often confuses pain with honor, that was a massive shift. The NHL rulebook and equipment standards would continue evolving for decades, but Plante's stand helped push hockey into the modern safety era. He forced the sport to admit something obvious that tradition had been hiding. A goalie should not have to risk his face to prove he belongs. Jacques Plante made the mask permanent in hockey culture. But he was not the first NHL goalie to wear one. That distinction is often connected to Clint Benedict, who wore a leather face protector in the 1920s after suffering a facial injury. Benedict's mask was primitive. It was not the sleek fiberglass mask associated with Plante, and it definitely was not close to the modern cages and helmets goalies wear today. But the idea was there. A goalie had been hurt. A goalie wanted protection, and the sport had to confront the same question it would keep facing for the next 100 years. How much danger is necessary for hockey to still feel like hockey? Benedict's experiment did not immediately change the sport. The culture was not ready. The equipment was not ready. The attitude around toughness was not ready. But that is why his story matters. Rule changes do not always happen the first time someone proves there is a problem. Sometimes the first person gets ignored. Then another person comes along years later and forces everyone to look again. Benedict showed that the idea existed. Plante made it impossible to dismiss. Together, they represent one of the most important transformations in hockey history: the slow death of the belief that protection equals weakness. And once that belief started to crack, it never fully came back. For decades, hockey had a simple but dangerous attitude toward big hits. If you had your head down, that was your problem. That mindset created some of the most famous open ice hits in NHL history. It also created a growing list of concussions, shortened careers, and ugly debates about what the sport should allow. Matt Cook became one of the central figures in that debate. Cook was not the only player delivering controversial hits. He was not the only reason the NHL changed. But his name became attached to one of the league's most important safety conversations. In 2010, Cook hit Boston Bruins center Mark Savard with a blindside shot to the head. Savard was one of the league's top playmakers. The hit caused a serious concussion, and Savard's career was never the same. At the time, the hit was not penalized the way many people expected. That created outrage. Fans, media, players, and executives were all forced to confront a major problem. The game was too fast, too powerful, and too dangerous for the old standard. Soon after, the NHL introduced Rule 48, targeting illegal checks to the head, especially blindside or lateral hits where the head was the principal point of contact. The rule evolved over time, but the message was clear. The league could no longer treat every devastating head hit as just part of the game. Cook's hit on Savard became one of the defining examples of why change was necessary. And this is where hockey's rule history gets complicated, because for some fans, these hits were part of the sport's identity. They saw open ice collisions as intimidation, punishment, and physical theater. But for others, the cost had become impossible to ignore. Players were bigger, faster, stronger, equipment had become harder, collisions were more violent, and the science around concussions was becoming more difficult to dismiss. The NHL did not remove hitting. It did not become a non-contact league, but it started drawing a clearer line around the head. That line is still debated today. Every season, fans argue about suspensions, intent, contact points, and whether the league is consistent. But the direction changed, and Matt Cook's name remains part of that shift. Not because he invented dangerous hits, but because one of his most infamous hits helped force the NHL to stop pretending the old rules were enough. In the 1970s, the Philadelphia Flyers became the most feared team in hockey. They were skilled, but that is not what made them famous. They were violent, relentless, intimidating. They were the Broad Street Bullies. And no player symbolized that era quite like Dave the Hammer Schultz. Schultz fought constantly. In the 1974-75 season, he set an NHL record with 472 penalty minutes, a number that still sounds unreal. The Flyers used intimidation as a strategy. If you wanted to beat them, you had to survive them first. And for a while, it worked. Philadelphia won back-to-back Stanley Cups in 1974 and 1975. Their style became a major part of NHL identity, but it also created a problem for the league. How much fighting was too much? How much intimidation could the NHL allow before the game started looking less like hockey and more like organized chaos? The league's response did not happen all at once. Fighting remained part of the sport. Enforcers continued to exist for decades, but over time, the NHL created and strengthened rules to control players who started fights, jumped unwilling opponents, or used intimidation outside the normal flow of play. The instigator rule became one of the most important tools in that battle. It was designed to punish players who clearly started altercations, especially when they forced fights on opponents who were not willing participants. Schultz was not the only reason the rule evolved. The NHL's fighting culture was much bigger than one man, but he became a symbol of the era that made these rules feel necessary. His career showed the league what could happen when intimidation became a central tactic instead of a side effect. And that is important because hockey has always tried to balance two identities. It wants to be physical, emotional, and intense. But it also wants to be a sport where skill can survive. The Broad Street Bullies pushed that balance to the edge. Schultz gave that edge a face, and the rulebook slowly started pushing back. Bobby Orr did not force one famous rule with his name on it, but he changed something even deeper. He changed what the sport believed a defenseman could be. Before Orr, defensemen were expected to defend first, move the puck, hold the blue line, and support the attack when appropriate. Then Orr arrived and turned the position into a weapon. He skated like a forward. He controlled the puck like a superstar center. He attacked with speed, created odd man rushes, and forced opponents to defend areas of the ice they had never expected a defenseman to own. Orr won scoring titles as a defenseman. He won the Hart Trophy. He won the Norris Trophy year after year. He made the impossible look normal. And when one player changes what normal looks like, the entire sport has to adjust. Coaches had to rethink defensive systems. Scouts had to look for different kinds of defensemen. Young players started imagining the position differently. The rulebook did not need a Bobby Orr rule because Orr changed the game at a more fundamental level. He changed the blueprint. After Orr, the idea of an offensive defenseman was no longer a luxury or a strange exception. It became something teams actively searched for. You can see his influence in every modern defenseman who joins the rush, quarterbacks the power play, walks the blue line, and acts as a fourth forward when the moment is right. Orr did not expose a loophole. He exposed a limitation in a hockey imagination. Before him, people thought they understood the position. After him, they had to rewrite the job description. And sometimes that is more powerful than changing a single rule. In the 1990s and early 2000s, the NHL had a problem. The game was full of talent, but too often, that talent was being dragged down. Literally. Hooks, holds, grabs, clutches, interference away from the puck. Defenders had learned how to slow down stars without always taking obvious penalties. The neutral zone became a battlefield of little illegal acts that were often ignored because they had become normal. And few players represented the frustration of that era more than Mario Lemieux. Lemieux was one of the most gifted players ever. His combination of size, hands, vision, and patience was almost unfair. But watching him in that era could be infuriating. Opponents hooked him, held him, leaned on him, wrapped him up, used sticks and bodies to slow him before he could fully create. This was not only about Lemieux, it happened to stars all over the league. But when a player that talented is constantly fighting through obstruction, the problem becomes impossible to hide. The NHL wanted offense, fans wanted skill, broadcasters wanted highlights. But the rulebook was being enforced in a way that allowed defensive players to suffocate the game. After the 2004-05 lockout, the league made a major enforcement push. Hooking, holding, interference, and obstruction were called much more strictly. The result was a faster, more open NHL. This was not a single-player rule in the way the Avery rule was, but Lemieux was one of the faces of the argument that the game had become too restrictive for its most talented players. The league had to decide what kind of product it wanted. Did it want a sport where the best players could create, or did it want a sport where lesser players could survive by grabbing them? The post-lockout crackdown was an answer. It said speed mattered, skill mattered, possession mattered. And if you could not defend without hooking or holding, that was your problem now. In that sense, players like Lemieux did not just inspire rule changes. They reminded the NHL what fans were paying to see. The most interesting thing about these stories is that the players were not all trying to change the NHL. Sean Avery probably was not thinking about the future of the rulebook. He was trying to annoy Martin Brodeur and win a playoff game. Martin Brodeur was not trying to kill the forecheck as a concept. He was using a skill that helped his team win. Wayne Gretzky was not campaigning for penalty reform. He was simply too dangerous with open ice. Bobby Hull and Stan Mikita were not holding an equipment seminar. They were chasing a better shot. Jacques Plante was not trying to become a symbol. He just did not want to put his injured face back in front of NHL shots without protection. Matt Cook was not trying to create a safer league. His hit became part of the evidence that the league needed one. Dave Schultz was not trying to write the future of fighting rules. He was playing the role his team valued in that era. And Bobby Orr did not need the rulebook to change because he changed the sport's imagination instead. That is how hockey evolves. Not cleanly, not politely, not always on purpose. The sport moves forward when someone pushes too far, dominates too completely, or reveals that the old system cannot handle the new reality. A rulebook can look boring from the outside, just pages of penalties, measurements, restrictions, and definitions. But behind those rules are stories. A goalie waving off tradition with a mask on his face, a superstar turning 4-on-4 into a nightmare, a pest standing in front of the greatest goalie of his generation and acting like a human windshield wiper, a puck-handling goalie so efficient that the NHL had to draw a forbidden zone behind the net, a hitter whose violence forced a new conversation about the brain, a shooter whose curved blade made the puck too dangerous to ignore. That is the real history of NHL rules. They are not just rules. They are scars. Every major change tells you where the game got hurt, where it got embarrassed, where it got too slow, too dangerous, too unfair, or too easy for one extraordinary player to exploit. And that is why these players matter. Because trophies tell us who won inside the game. But rule changes tell us who changed the game itself.